Thanks, Jude. It's always nice to be back at Borderlands. It's, yeah, at least 13 years, maybe. You used to be over on Octavia Street.
In the dank finished basement.
Yeah. Yeah, Alan's mother used to bring cookies. Yeah. That was nice.
She still does every once in a while.
Oh, that's good. Okay, yeah, today I'm going to be reading, there's a series of 4 novels I wrote, software, wetware, freeware, and realware. And the first one I wrote in the software I guess I wrote it in 1979. And it was just at the beginning of the cyberpunk movement, which didn't actually exist yet. I mean, it was just an idea that was in the air. And it's the word software was an unfamiliar word at that time. I'd seen it in the Scientific American, but wasn't a word that people used very much. But I had the idea that your personality is in some sense like the software that's in your brain, and your brain is a little bit like the hardware. And that idea is sort of a commonplace now, but in 1979 that wasn't an obvious idea. It took me about 6 months to figure it out. And then what happens in software is there's this race of autonomous robots who live on the moon, and they're undergoing a process of evolution. They keep building. They have factories. They're building new robots. There's a certain amount of mutations, asexual reproduction. They'll sometimes combine their programs, and survival of the fittest. I mean, who gets to put their software onto a new body? So they're competing. So they've evolved pretty well, and they're now they've come down to the Earth, and they're collecting people's brain software. They just think it's cool to have, or they might use it for something. And one of the themes in software, there's a character called Cobb Anderson, and they want to get his brain software so they can give him a nice new robot body. And he also has a younger friend called Stay High, who's a kind of a stoner, low-end kind of guy. And Stay High falls into the hands of a group of people, one of whom is one of these software collecting robots. And this is a scene in software that's sort of a famous scene. It's called the brain eating scene. Software chapter 5. The prick of a needle woke Stay High. He opened his eyes. His body seemed to have disappeared. He was just a head resting on a round red table. People looking at him. Greasers. And the chick he'd been with last. "Are you awake?" she said with brittle sweetness. She had a black eye. Stay High didn't answer right away. He had gone home with that woman, yeah. She had a cottage down the beach. And then they'd gotten drunk together on synthetic bourbon whiskey. He'd gotten drunk anyway, and must have blacked out. Last thing he remembered was breaking something, her holocaster, crunching the silicon chips underfoot and shouting. Shouting what? "You'll feel better in a minute," the woman added in that same falsely bright tone. He heard her poodle whimpering from across the room. He had a memory of throwing it, arcing it along a flat, fuzzy, parabolic path. One of the men at the table shifted in his chair. He wore mirror shades and had short hair. He had his shirt off. It seemed like another hot day. The man's foot scuffed Stay High's shin. So Stay High had a body after all. It was just that his body was tied up under the table, and his head was sticking out through a hole in the tabletop. The table was split and had hinges on one side and a hook and eye on the other. "Stocks and bonds," Stay High said finally. There's a nasty-looking implement lying on the table. It plugged into the wall. He attempted to smile. "What's the story? You mad about the holocaster? I'll give you mine." He hoped the dog wasn't hurt. At least it was well enough to be whimpering. No one but the chick wanted to meet his eyes. It was like they were ashamed of what they were going to do to him. The stuff they'd shot him up with was taking hold. As his brain speeded up, the scene around him seemed to slow down. The man with no shirt stood up with dream-like slowness and walked across the room. He had words tattooed on his back. It was too hard to read. The man had gained so much weight since getting tattooed that the words were all pulled down on both sides. "What do you want?" Stay-High said again. "What are you going to do to me?" Counting the chick, there were 5 of them, 3 men and 2 women. The other woman had stringy red hair dyed green. The woman he'd picked up was the only one who looked at all middle class. Date bait. "Y'all want some killer weed?" drawled one of the men. He had a pimp mustache and a pockmarked face. He wore a chromed tire chain around his neck with his name in big letters, Purdue. Also hanging from the chain was a little mesh pouch full of hand-rolled cigarettes. "Not me," Stay-Eye said. "I'm high on life." No one laughed. The big man with no shirt came back across the room. He held 5 cheap steel spoons. "We really going to do it, Phil?" the girl with green hair asked him. "We really going to do it?" Purdue passed a crystal joint to his neighbor, a bald man with half his teeth missing. Exactly half the teeth gone, so that one side of his face was flaccid and caved in, while the other was still fresh and beefy. He took a long hit and picked up the machine that was lying on the table. "Take the lid off, half and half," the chick with the black eye urged. "Open the bastard up." "We really going to do it?" the green-haired girl exclaimed and giggled shrilly. "I ain't never ate no live brain before." "It's a stuzzy high, Rainbow," Phil told her. With his fat and his short hair, he looked stupid, but his way of speaking was precise and confident. He seemed to be the leader. "This ought to be a good brain, too. Full of chemicals, I imagine." Half and half seemed to be having some trouble starting the little cutting machine up. It was a variable heat blade. They're going to cut off the top of Stay-High's skull and eat his brain with those cheap steel spoons. He would be able to watch them, at first. Someone started screaming. Someone tried to stand up, but he was tied too tightly. The variable blade was on now, set at 1 centimeter, the thickness of the skull. Stay-High threw his head back and forth wildly as half and half leaned towards him. There was no way to read the ruined face's expression. "Hold still, damn you," the chick with the black eye shouted. "It's no good if we have to knock you out." Stay-High didn't really hear her. His mind had temporarily snapped. He just kept screaming and thrashing his head around. The sound of his shrill voice was like a lattice around him. He tried to weave the lattice thicker. The little pimp with the tire chain went and got a towel from the bathroom. He wedged it around Stay-High's neck and under his chin to keep the head steady. Stay-High screamed louder, higher. "Stuff his mouth," the green-haired girl cried. "He's yelling and all." "No," Phil said. "The noise is like part of the trip. Wave with it, baby." The Chinese used to do this to monkeys. It's so wiggly when you spoon out the speech centers and the guy's tongue stops moving, just all that. He stopped and the flesh of his face moved in a smile. Half and half leaned forward again. There was a slight smell of singed flesh as the heat blade dug in over Stay-High's right eyebrow. Attracted by the food smell, the little poodle came stiffly trotting across the room. It tried to hop over the heat blade's electric cord, but didn't quite make it. The plug popped out of the wall. Half and half uttered a muffled, lisping exclamation. "He says, 'Get the dog out of here,'" Purdue interpreted. "He don't think it's sanitary with no dog in here." Sullenly, the chick with the black eye got up to get the dog. The sudden pain over his eyebrow had brought Stay-High back to rationality. Somewhere in there he had stopped screaming. If there were any neighbors, they would have heard him by now. He thought hard. The heat blade would cauterize the wound as it went. That meant he wouldn't be bleeding when they took the top of his skull off. So what? So the fuck what? Another wave of wild panic swept over him. He strained upward so hard that the table shifted half a meter. The edge of the hole in the table began cutting into the side of his neck. He couldn't breathe. He saw spots and the room darkened. "He's choking," Phil cried. He jumped to his feet and pushed the table back across the uneven floor. The table screeched and vibrated. Stay-High threw himself upward again before half and half could get the heat blade restarted. Anything for time, no matter how pointless. But the vibrating of the table had knocked open the little hook and eye latch. The two halves of the table yawned open, and Stay-High fell over onto the floor. His feet were tied together and his hands were tied behind his back. He had time to notice that the people at the table were wearing brightly colored sneakers with alphabets around the edges. The little kidders. He'd always thought the newscasters had made the gang up. Someone was hammering at the door, harder and harder. 5 pairs of kids' sneakers scampered out of the room. Stay High heard a window open, and then the door splintered. More feet. Shiny black lace-up shoes. Cop shoes. So that's the end of that scene. And in the next novel, then they go up to the moon, and they have this whole thing with the robots up there. They're called boppers. And in the next one, which is called WARE, the boppers get into adjusting our DNA, so programming things into our DNA. But I think just for kicks, for my next reading, I will skip ahead a little bit to the third one, freeware. And by freeware, the robots have become, they're no longer made of kind of silicon and boxes and so on. They're made of this stuff called flicker cladding, which is, somebody before the talk was asking about cellular automata. And in a way, flicker cladding are like a type of computer graphics called cellular automata. They're this plastic. It's always bothered me that computers are sort of brittle and, hard and boxy. It'd be nice if they were soft things. And so flicker cladding is this sort of like silly putty, but it's full of circuits. And the circuits are not in any way metal or electric. They're actually circuits that are based on fungus. There's this mold that grows inside this plastic. So the plastic is, it's able to stretch and shrink. It can glow. And this sort of brain in it is run by this sort of fungus that lives inside it. And so these creatures, they're called moldies because they've got mold inside their bodies. And they smell sort of bad. And they also have nuggets of fungus, of sort of truffle-like nuggets inside them that some people like to take to get high. But but the people, of course, there's humans who want to have sex with the moldies, and of course, all those people are men. And those people are called cheese balls because they like the sort of cheesy reek of the moldies. Now, it's a little dangerous to have sex with a moldy because there's this sort of back and forth game going on. The humans have developed these sort of what they call leech dims. They're sort of control patches, and they like to slap that onto a moldy, and then you can control the moldy remotely. It becomes your slave. But the moldies, on the other hand, they like to stick a tendril up through your nose and then punch through the roof of your palate and put a little kind of controller thing inside your head, and then they can control you. So it's sort of a war going on. So anyway, Chapter 1, Monique, from Freeware. Monique glided over to Randy Carl Tucker's door and knocked. He opened it, and Monique mamboed on in. The room smelled like Tucker's breath. Tucker's oven was sitting on the desk, projecting a hollow of a pornographic soap opera. An oven, it's like an iPod, except it's soft, and you can wear it on your neck. "Yar there," said Monique, synthesizing the sounds on a fluttering membrane near the back of her mouth cavity. "I saw you, gesturing to me before. Is there something I can, do for you?" Monique's sort of a maid in this motel, and sometimes the customers will come on to her. Randy Carl Tucker. Tucker's thin mouth lengthened a bit in a sly, lustful smile. He's from Kentucky. "I knowed you'd come back. That's why I've been setting here a-waiting. Just close the door to begin with, you little stinker, and pull the drapes before we start a-carrying on." He was clean-shaven and his eyes were flat and pale. 2 women on the porno soap were arguing over a boyfriend. "I'm not sure I can help you, sir," said knowing Monique, sliding the door closed and pulling the curtain across it. "Terry Persesepe, she's the manager here, she was just telling me this morning that it's not proper for me to have any kind of intimacy with the guests. The Clearlight Terrace Court Motel is a place for wholesome family fun." Those were Terry's exact words. Monique set her arms akimbo, flexed the erectile tissues of her breast mounds, and waggled the hip-like swelling below her waist. So, like, what is it that you want from me, country boy? She pouted out her lips and giggled. Moving as stagely as one of the actors on the soap, Tucker paused to take a slurp from a cardboard cup of coffee printed with the logo of the Daffo Deli down on the beach. He looked solemnly up from his cup, only to lose his composure and break into a cackle at Monique's beckoning gyrations. For now Monique was milling her arms and flinging them out like a pom-pom cheerleader. "You're a pippy hunk of cheese, ain't you?" said Tucker. "To hell with what your boss says, Monique. You show me a good time, and I'll pay you plenty." Monique undulated forward across the motel room's carpeted floor, standing right up against the man, opening her skin fissures to release an even headier mixture of her bouquet. "Can you authorize a charge to your account now, Randy?" "How?" "I'm the bookkeeper as well as the maid, Mr. Tucker. Will you authorize the charge?" Monique reached out and undid one of the buttons of his long-sleeved white plastic shirt. His gray pants and black plastic belt were as cheap-looking as the shirt. His hair was short and unclean. His thin skin was spotty from acne and a faded tan, and Monique could see his faintly pulsing blue veins beneath the skin's surface. His nose was a bit crooked, and he had a large Adam's apple. All right," the man mumbled reluctantly, "but put it down as... I'll just average it into your, room rate," said Monique. "It won't show, but you have to come out and say just what it is that you want me to do." Monique smiled hugely and released a cloud of spores. "So that you can't frame me for prostitution? In case you're a, heritagist? So now please tell me what you want, Randy." "I want you to blow me, damn it." "And what's wrong with heritagists anyway?" "That's what you are?" "I ain't saying that I hold their beliefs, but I knowed a few of 'em back in Shively. The heritagists have done me some good from time to time." "What would they think about your wanting to have sex with a moldy?" Tucker sighed. "They'd understand it perfectly. Why the hell do you think they talk about it so much?" "I'm way past that loser guilt shit, Monique. All the things I've done, it's hard to believe I'm only 21. Tucker stared intensely at Monique, as if trying to read her mind. Finally, he reached some internal decision and looked away. "Let's just say I'm a peculiar man and I got my needs. Can we get started now?" "I'd love to," said Monique dryly. She finished unbuttoning Randy's shirt, and now she undid his pants. She paused, looking at him. He was weedy and thin, but with a certain amount of muscle. She was going to have to be sure to get a tight chokehold on him when she went up his nose and punched into his cranium. Now he lay back on his bed, and Monique pressed against him, letting her tissues flow and reshape to mold themselves so as to fully envelop Randy's private parts. Sexually, it meant no more to her than pushing a wheelbarrow would mean to a human. Monique set up some caressing rhythms, trying to rock the weight up to speed. While Tucker wheezed and twitched in mounting excitement, Monique set her right forefinger to growing like a vine. She twined it up along Tucker's torso and wrapped once around his neck. Feeling leery of starting to choke Tucker right away, Monique went ahead and slid the tip of her 4-foot-long finger into Tucker's nose, at the same time setting some chaotic ripples onto his genitals. But now, instead of lying back in blind ecstasy, Tucker suddenly sat up and started clawing at his face and neck. "What the hell you think you're doing to my nose, bitch? Thought you'd give me a thinking cap, didn't you?" Weirdly enough, he sounded not so much angry as excited, and he made a rattling noise that sounded almost like a cackle. Monique tightened herself around his neck as much as possible and punched her tendril with all her might against the spot high up at the back of Tucker's nose, but it wouldn't give. She punched and punched again, but it was like Tucker's skull was patched with titanoplast or something. Monique couldn't get in. And now Tucker had wormed his right hand between Monique's noose and his throat, and she couldn't choke him anymore. With his left hand, he yanked Monique's tendril out of his nose. He got to his feet and started kicking at Monique's body. Monique squeezed his testicles so hard that he screamed and fell sideways, crashing onto the desk and plopping the oven and its holograms to the floor. This was turning into a full-scale disaster. If Monique ran off now, Tucker would tell people about Monique's attack on him, and she'd be hunted down and exterminated. She had to finish him off. Tucker was on his back now, and Monique was on his nude body like a savage vampire slug. There was a fight scene playing on the hollow, too, which seemed to be drowning out Tucker's cries so far. Or maybe all the people in the nearby rooms were out on the beach where they belonged, instead of lurking inside, waiting to have sex with a moldy like this scungy, heritageous bastard. Tucker had hold of his travel bag now and was fumbling to unlatch it. A gun? A gun couldn't hurt a moldy. With his left arm out of the way, Monique was free to shove a fat tendril down his throat. She'd been on the point of calling her husband Zlotl for help, but now she was sure she was going to win. There was a good weak spot in the skull right behind the roof of the flesher's mouth, and it wasn't armored like the spot in his nose. By flesher. But just as Monique began to push, something leapt out of Tucker's suitcase and slapped up against her, and everything changed. Instead of being on top of the struggling Randy Carl Tucker, Monique was curled up on the floor beside him. His voice was inside her, whispering to her. She could make no move without his permission. Even her thoughts were not fully her own. Yeah, you just lay still for now, Monique, Randy said, getting to his feet. Nice little tussle you put up there. A lively little two-legged imipolex creature was strutting back and forth on the floor like a chicken. It was the thing that had jumped at Monique. Back in the bag, Willa Jean, Randy told it. You done good. You pasted that super leech on her just in time. He coughed and went to the bathroom to drink some water. The chicken stood there staring at Monique. It had a fuzzy purple patch on its back. It moved tentatively closer and gave Monique's face a gentle peck, then a harder one, gouging out and absorbing a little strip of Monique's imipolex. Back in the bag, Willa Jean, repeated Randy, coming out of the bathroom. Now. The creature hopped into Randy's bag and he closed it back up. Randy dug in his pocket and examined a couple of small purple patches of imipolex he found there. Then he picked up the room's oven and called someone, using a voice connection alone. Arby? Randy here, old son. Got me one. How soon can y'all get the boat out there? Copacetic. I'm starting now. He turned off the oven. We going for a swim, Randy told Monique, this time without speaking out loud. We'll walk outside and you'll rickshaw me down the cliff at Steber Lane. We gonna step lively so your boss don't stop us. So Randy's going to abduct Monique and take her back to the moon. It gets kind of complicated. That scene was set in Santa Cruz. I like Santa Cruz a lot. That's an actual motel where I stayed. It wasn't that exciting when we stayed there. But, and then, a lot of freeware is set in San Francisco, too. Now, the last one was called RealWare, and what happens in freeware, by the way, there's also some aliens that show up, and they begin. One of the themes that I was doing in the WARE books, I was kind of trying to increasingly generalize what it means to have a mind. And so in software, the idea was you could maybe extract the software from your body so you could be a pattern of information. And then in wetware, it was the idea of you don't actually need to have a machine to run the information. You can be running the information on organisms, which in a way we already knew. And in freeware, what happens, we know there's very powerful cosmic rays that are always zapping into the atmosphere. And, they come from very far away in space. And people often say, well, if aliens are coming to visit us, how would they travel? And it seems to me that probably the easiest way to travel across the galaxy would be to encrypt yourself, basically zip yourself up in the software sense, compress yourself into this very tiny information pattern that you could basically encrypt in the oscillations of a heavy particle. And then you send that particle across. And then essentially the particle has to hit something in which it can be unzipped. Like there's a lot of zipped files floating around the web, but unless they land on a computer that happens to have be able to decompress that, They don't go anywhere. And it turns out the bodies of these moldies turn out to be good things for decompressing this alien software. And so what happens with freeware is some of the moldies actually become aliens. It's freeware, because you got it. It came in a cosmic ray. Maybe you didn't want to have it, but you get it, and it was free. Now, in RealWare, the whole idea of matter becomes sort of hypothetical, because the aliens have this device called an Allah that lets people, you can basically think about something and then you feed it into the Allah and the Allah will kind of create it. It's an old science fiction dream of direct matter manipulation, creating objects out of thin air. And so there's a little scene in RealWare that's it's a nice visual scene. So there's a show going on stage. It's on a boat, one of the abandoned boats down near 3rd Street in San Francisco. Babs, giving Randy's leg a big pinch, said, "Bite." Uh-oh, Shimmer and Ptah are going on stage. Babs had been around moldies for most of her life. She'd been 5 when her father sponsored the Moldy Citizenship Act of 2038, and there had been a steady stream of grateful moldy visitors ever since. And of course, Babs' mother herself was part moldy. That is, Wendy Mooney's personality lived in a moldy, happy cloak that had a symbiotic relationship with Wendy's human flesh. In the natural course of things, Babs had seen moldies having sex a number of times. Moldies weren't modest. It excited her even less than seeing 2 dogs fucking, which was not at all. But Shimmer and Ptah certainly did give a spirited performance. They bounced up onto the stage, began embracing each other, and just for the goof of it, Shimmer pushed her body right through Ptah's, his bronze flesh forming itself back together on the other side of the marble Shimmer. Ptah did the same to Shimmer, and then they corkscrewed themselves together so tightly that they looked like a candy cane or a barber pole. To top off the foreplay, Shimmer divided herself into an archipelago of separate globs, and Ptah juggled her. While continuing to juggle, Ptah began pinching off more and more globs of himself until all that was left of him was a pair of hands down on the platform of the stage, incredibly keeping some 2 white and bronze balls aloft. And then the bronze hands became balls as well. Before the balls could all tumble out of the air, 2 of the white balls stuck to the ground and formed themselves into hands and took over the juggling. At each round, another white ball stuck to the hands, and the hands grew into arms, into a torso, and finally into all of Shimmer, juggling bronze globs of Ptah, and then Shimmer stepped aside, and Ptah's globs somehow sprang together in midair, reassembling the grinning bronze Superman all at once. Even Babs had to applaud for this. But now the inevitable had to happen. Ramses' music took on an urgent, throbbing tone, and Shimmer and Ptah swooned to the ground. They softened their flesh to a near liquid state and pasted their bodies together, opening up their pores enough to exchange wet flows of imipellax that carried along cells of their algae and their fungal mold. The mold nerve magic took over, and they shuddered in a mutual orgasm. A musty, cheesy reek came drifting down from the stage. Babs peered over at Randy. His eyes were wide and his mouth was open. Emboldened by her 2 beers, Babs couldn't resist letting her hand steal over to gauge the state of Randy's excitement. "Oh yes, Babs," moaned Randy. "Please touch it." Well, why not? Just for a minute anyway. She slipped her hand under the waistband of Randy's baggy pants. A girl could definitely do something with this. So that's the end of that scene. So maybe, I don't know, often people enjoy the questions as much as the reading, so maybe that's enough reading for right now. So if you don't have any questions, I'll read more. But let's have a few questions. Yeah.
So were you tempted to, or did you, tamper with the original manuscripts and you reissued them now?
A little bit.
20 years.
There's always, well, I thought maybe I wouldn't change them at all, but after all, I'm a writer, and when I see one of my manuscripts, I just can't help but tweaking it. But I tried to only tweak it in ways where where the word order was bad, or where it was. Sometimes when you read something and you haven't read it for a while, you can see that the flow is a little confusing. So mainly it was just things of that nature. I didn't do anything that particular to Bowdlerize it or make it less offensive, because that would have been just too big a job.
I was thinking more along the lines of all the changes in technology. So 1979, this was quite different.
Yeah, I did. It really, because this was said in the future, it was actually said in 2020, which is coming up on us, but I didn't have to do too much with the technology. Well, there's one technological aspect that is sort of funny, but it's sort of like you don't want to change it because it's kind of cute. I mentioned in software there's this guy Cobb Anderson, and the robots are they eat his brain and they extract his software, and then they're going to run it in a computer, and that way he's going to live again. And they build an android body for him to run. But again, when I wrote this, it was 1979, and at that point I just couldn't wrap my mind around the idea that a computer as powerful as a human brain would fit in a skull, because at this point computers lived in basements, of maybe one building on campus. So the computer that's running Cobb's mind is in an ice cream truck. There's also this brief notion that if computers were super cooled, they would work better. There's these things called Josephson junctions, and at one point these were viewed as a big future of computers, but those had to be in liquid helium. So, that he's got his brain is in a computer, but the computer weighs a ton, and it has to be kept at near absolute zero, and so it follows him around in this ice cream truck that has this evil grinning statue of Mr. Frosty on the top, and so that was sort of a kind of an old-fashioned thing, but then I left it in anyway because it made for some nice scenes. And of course, like so many other science fiction writers, I didn't anticipate cell phones, but actually I had this thing pretty early in the book that I always talk about, the UVVY, UVVY, and it's this little thing like a slug, and you wear it on your neck, and it can have a direct interface with your nervous system, and it can project holograms. It's sort of, again, a little bit like an iPhone, but it's stuck to your neck.
Probably coming.
I would think so, yeah. Well, one of the big things still that always, I still don't see why they haven't quite solved this, is when you get these digital devices, when you see people like doing on the keyboards, these tiny BlackBerry keyboards, that looks very, very unpleasant to use. And as a writer, I certainly wouldn't want to write a novel that way. And so you do have a full-size keyboard, and then you'll get a netbook, and they'll say, well, the keyboard, it's 0.9 as big as a real keyboard, but if I tried to type on something that's 0.9, it just doesn't work for me. Maybe I could adapt, but there's this thing, why can't the machines adapt to me? Why am I adapting to the machine? So it seems really there should be something that, it could be like bicycle gloves where they just cover this and not your fingers, and you could just type in the air or on the counter. They've made some things like that. There was this thing of projecting an image of a keyboard, and the iPad keyboard I think is full size. I haven't really tried to use it very much though. But anyway, the interface is still a problem. Yeah?
Why are all the accents or many of the characters Southern?
Well, the parts I read you, there were two people. The little kidders, they were sort of Florida rednecks. And that was, well, maybe I should tell you that I grew up in Kentucky. Okay? I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, so I have a fondness for Kentucky accents. And Randy Carl Tucker, you might say he's my alter ego. Though I'm not really partial to having sex with robots, but I like him. He grew up in Louisville, kind of a bad part of Louisville. There's this less affluent part of Louisville called Shively, and that's where he came from. And he had sort of an interesting childhood, but I won't go into the details here. But so that's, I kind of enjoy writing that. And the Florida people, we actually did, my wife and I stayed in an inexpensive motel in Cocoa Beach. This was when I sort of got the idea for software. This was a very long time ago. This would have been around 1977. And we used to live in upstate New York, and I was a professor there at a small college in the State University of New York system. And we would hoard our money and then drive down to Florida or to North Carolina for a spring vacation or summer vacation. And we made it to Cocoa Beach, and we were staying at these motels. And there were these sort of sinister Florida kind of biker types with tattoos, and it was funny. And that sort of gave me the inspiration for software. I had the idea for writing it while we were there.
Are there any predictions that you're particularly proud of that have come true? Or?
That's sometimes I can think of them. Let's see. That you want to be able to say, well, I predicted that, Heinlein used to be proud that he predicted the remote handling hands, they're called Waldos, that they use in nuclear reactors. And in a way I predicted, I don't know, just the whole idea of turning the human mind into software was sort of not a familiar idea at this time. So that was something I sort of predicted. And the whole cyberpunk thing was in a way something I was anticipating here. This would certainly be called one of the very first cyberpunk books. I mean, Neuromancer and Software would probably be the first two that would come to mind. And the thing of wetware, something I've been into recently. I've always liked this idea of computation getting out of these beige buzzing plastic boxes that we have, or metal boxes. And one of the ideas that I liked is the wetware computation, where we take a biological system, and they talk about nanotechnology, but in a way biology, that's what biology is doing. It's doing nanotechnology. And if we master nanotechnology, it's probably not going to be tiny gears made out of diamonds. I mean, it's like a category mistake. If we're going to do things at the molecular scale, this could be very much like the way biology does it with the enzymes and the DNA and the RNA, and so it seems like that's probably the way that I see it happening. And take it a step further. Something I didn't get into really in this series, but I talked about in two later novels called Post-Singular and Hylozoic. I like the idea of, if you look at the physics, any chaotic process, like flowing water or air currents or flame, these all, in some sense, their behavior is rich enough that they can support universal computation. They can actually behave in any possible way. And at this stage, it's sort of, we just don't know how to do the input-output to a bowl of water, but that really could be your computer. And looking at a deeper level, there's quantum computation, which there was a period when, sometimes if you're a science fiction writer, you sort of got your rap figured out, and then the scientists come up with something new that you weren't using, and there's a tendency to turn fuddy-duddy and say, well, that's bullshit. I'm not going to use that. But a science fiction writer is never really in a position to accuse people of being bullshit. That's our profession, So, and then I started liking the idea of quantum computation. For me, the turning point was somebody said, whenever you have light bouncing off an object, you're having a quantum computation take place there. I mean, it's sort of very ordinary. It doesn't have to be, in a bath of liquid helium, or on a stable mercury table or anything. Any object, all the atoms in there are sort of vibrating and exchanging things, and there's a sense in which there's a computation taking place. And if we could find some way to tap into that, we really have all the computation that we want is all around us. So and people often have trouble accepting this because we have a lot invested in the idea of our chip-based computers, but I mean, we don't use watches made out of gears anymore. And that's only been 60 years, since the switch happened. So why do you think in 100 years we'd be using computers made out of silicon chips? I mean, to me, that it seems very, very unlikely that things change, and we always think, well, now we're done, and everything's here. But so that's something that's always interested me, and that was kind of a theme that was driving me throughout software of, again, kind of blurring the line between different kinds of reality and computation, and then what is computation, and playing with it. And so that was something I had fun doing.
There's a train of thought leading to this question, but I won't get into it because it's very long. Do you see connections between the creative processes of writing and painting?
Writing and painting? Well, in recent years, I started painting in about 11 years ago. I was writing a novel about the painter Peter Bruegel, the Elder. Some people pronounce his name Bruegel. In Holland, they say Brokel, but I say Bruegel. Anyway, the Peter Bruegel, and in fact, Jude is just holding the novel up. That was my one historical novel, and I didn't put science fiction in there. I didn't want to drag Bruegel in the gutter. So, but his life was very interesting anyway. And while I was doing that, my wife and I went to a night class in painting, and I really got to like painting. And so now I paint a lot. I might paint. I mean, sometimes I won't do it for a few months, but recently, right now I'm between novels, and so I'm painting more than usual. I'll do maybe a painting every month. And it is a very different process from writing because, there's similarities and there's differences. There's an emergent aspect to painting, maybe more so than writing, where you're just globbing the stuff on and seeing what you like, and you can just get a shape and play with it. And I like the analog quality, the way the colors merge together. Writing is, in some ways, it's sort of digital in that you're typing letters, but there is a sort of blurring quality. You can just put these scenes out there and see what happens. But it's a less. Also, doing a painting is a less. I mean, if you write a novel, it's like you're building a pyramid or a skyscraper. It's a very long process. And my friend Terry Bisson, he kind of prefers writing stories to writing novels. And he says, well, writing a story is like you work in a body shop. You get something in there and you hammer on it, and then in a week you're done and it's all shiny and you send it out. And being a novelist is like being a farmer. You have to go out in this field day after day, month after month, and be cultivating it there. And painting is more closer to the short story because you get it done. And but I like, in any case, when I'm doing something creative, one thing I like is it sort of turns off my inner monologue. Because like many people, I think I spend a lot of time worrying about the past and the future, and trying to make plans. And then when I'm doing something creative, I sort of get out of that. I forget myself. I become part of the work that I'm doing. And painting is very, very pleasant that way. So I do actually have. I made a book out of it with I think 64 of my paintings in it, and that's a book I produced myself and actually printed via Lulu. And I brought a few of those in here today. It's called Better Worlds. And I have some prints also. I got a high-quality Canon printer with 10 colors of ink, and I printed it on this nice museum-quality paper. So if you want to get one of those, we have a few of the prints here too. So maybe that's enough for today. So thanks for coming out, and Jude's got some books and prints if you're interested. And thanks again.
Thank you.